Welcome to this webinar, everyone. We're glad that you could be with us for a webinar on intersectional teaching and leading. It is designed for the classroom where professors may teach. It's also designed with congregations where rostered leaders serve, also in mind. I'm grateful to the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago and for Wartburg Theological Seminary for hosting this webinar, and to the Wabash Center for the grant that supported the learning that led to this time together. The five of us on this panel have studied intersectional practices this past year, and we've learned how important it is and can be to get to name oneself present in your full identity. And so we're going to pause for a moment here, right at the beginning of our webinar, so that you, if you'd like to, and to the extent that you choose, you can write in any of these kinds of things into the chat. I'm going to put it there now. Maybe you want to say your name the way you like it to be said, or intersectionalities that you yourself inhabit, or perhaps you'll name intersectionalities regarding which you've spent the most time learning about, or you've given the most care around. So we'll take a minute then to give ourselves some space for typing. I'm seeing through the Q&A that the chat is disabled. So let's go ahead and use the Q&A for this. We'll recognize by the end that these are not, in fact, the questions, but are part of the answer, right? So we could use the Q&A function for this, I think. And thanks for those who let me know. You know what someone else is noting to us? That we can easily enable the chat. So LSTC, if you want to do that, I leave it up to you. Let's dive a little further forward together. Jess is going to drop into the chat a Google form, and that Google form is going to do two things for us. One, it's a way for you to say more about who you are, if you'd like. And then secondly, it's a way to sign up for our deliverables. So if you want to receive things like our toolkit with ideas that we have for intersectional teaching and learning that you can use in your own spaces, then you would use that Google form then to let us know, and we will be then emailing those out to you. So please fill out this Google form if you'd like to receive our resource kit, and if you'd like to stay in touch longer. Throughout this webinar, then you are free to write questions in the Q&A that we will respond to as time is available at the end. And now it is with great pleasure that I get to briefly introduce you to our panelists. Helen Chuka currently teaches Hebrew Bible at Wartburg Theological Seminary. She is an ordained minister of the Andhra Evangelical Lutheran Church, hails from Guntur, Andhra Pradesh, India. She enjoys engaging with narratives in the prose of the Hebrew Bible, contextual biblical interpretation, Dalit feminist theology, and juxtaposing, films, and biblical texts. Reverend Jessica Heron is an ordained ELCA pastor who writes, educates online, and consults about anti-oppressive worldviews, plus endeavors to live anti-oppressively as much as possible. She has previously served several congregations and worked as a hospital chaplain. Pastor Jess is currently the volunteer pastor of Open Heart Faith Gathering, which is her second mission community. Carrie Aldridge is assistant professor of New Testament at the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago. Her research focuses on queer hermeneutics, trauma studies, and womanist or feminist dialogical biblical interpretation. Dr. Aldridge teaches courses focused on how interpretations of sacred texts influence societal power structures, especially with regards to gender, sexuality, and race ethnicity. Her classes foster learning communities in which members can explore questions about identity, marginalizations, and justice within antiquity as well as today. Reverend Lamont Anthony Wells is executive director of the Network for Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, Colleges and Universities. A graduate of Morehouse College and the Interdenominational Theological Center, he has also completed certification programs at Harvard University, Princeton University, the University of Pennsylvania, and Cornell University. Reverend Wells is frequently called to share insightful and inspiring messages of ecumenism, interfaith plurality, queer identity, social justice, inclusion, and belonging, which motivates him as a leader and community organizer. And I'm Jan Schnell, a liturgical theologian and religious ethicist. I'm trained as a Lutheran pastor and an assistant professor of liturgics at Wartburg Theological Seminary. In addition to worship, I teach preaching, queer theology, community organizing, and I get to co-teach with Lamont, Dismantling Racism. This group of panelists, then, we got a grant from Wabash to study and discuss how to become intersectionally aware teachers and leaders. We recognize that there are so many beautiful forms of intersectionalities that we needed to be specific about some particular intersectionalities that we could predictably consider well together. So for the purposes then of this grant work, our group was able to focus on the intersectionalities of disability studies, anti-racism, and queer theology. We've centered our work around this guiding question: what deters and contributes to effective learning at the intersections of anti-racism, disability studies, and queer theology? We had noticed that every year, parishioners and students show up with a wide variety of experiences, biases, skillfulness at interrogating injustices, and therefore with vast differences in their competencies to engage intersectionalities well. And we have jobs where we teach and guide an array of students while helping them grow in their own competencies around being intersectionally aware. At the same time, or nevertheless, there don't seem to be many sustained conversations about pedagogical practices that are attentive to these values. Neither are we finding discussions regarding intersectionality and the complexities that could help us do predictably well in the places where we minister and teach. So in order to prepare leaders who are ready to celebrate and minister within the beautiful diversity of God's good creation, some questions needed to be asked about what is lacking in our pedagogical approaches and what teaching and leading practices might be most effective for activating our stated commitments. within the ministering and lives of our graduates. So our journey has included things like reading and discussions, but also workshops on storytelling and the development of teaching tools. And now we're so glad to get to share from the questions that we've been asking and from what we've learned. With that, I turn it over to Helen.
Thank you, Jan. I want to begin by embracing the invitation of Dalit feminist scholar Swati Margaret, who emphasizes the need to define oneself. She says, if we do not define ourselves for ourselves, we will be defined by others for their use and to our detriment. I am an educated, middle-class, able-bodied, straight, Christian, Dalit woman, wife and a mother who has had the privilege of receiving education in the US and currently teaching in an American institution. I identify as a Dalit woman and have overlapping experiences of caste and gender discrimination comparable to the Dalit women in India. However, I am mindful of the privileges and the access to resources. Why do we need intersectional pedagogies? In one of my presentations last year, I addressed the dominance of Dalit men in theological and ecumenical institutions and the marginalization of Dalit women's experiences and voices in Indian context. After the presentation, a theologically trained Dalit man asked me, are you a Dalit or a woman? Although this question might be dismissed as naive, it is not. It is shaped by at least three assumptions. First, that the Dalit experience is monolithic. Second, that the women engaging in Dalit discourse should be willing to abandon or suppress their identity as women. Third, it subtly implies that Dalit women have no place in Dalit discourse and that they don't appropriately belong to the discourse on Dalit, but to the discourse of gender. Dalit women are thrice marginalized due to their caste, class, and gender. And to view the Dalit woman question as exclusively gendered does no justice to them. Forms of oppression do not work independent of each other, but in connection with each other. Even before the term intersectionality is popularized in 1989, Dalit feminist scholars and anti-caste thinkers have viewed and addressed the oppression of Dalit women intersectionally. There is an ancestral wisdom that informed us that an intersectional lens enables us to appropriately address the fallacies of the univocal or single-axis approaches. Single-axis approaches do not provide holistic perspectives. On the contrary, multi-axial approaches enable us to affirm the plurivocity of the text. Intersectional pedagogies are essential because they teach us to transgress the dominant banking models and invites us into a world of possibilities. It is important because it embodies care, grace, and hospitality. It is important because it enables us to be willing and open to the risk of being at the crossroads, to be able to see, view, perceive the issues with clarity and in their relation to power and privilege. In this limited time, I want to highlight at least two aspects of why intersectionality is important for especially those within the ministries. Intersectionality is biblical. First of all, intersectionality is biblical. In the post-resurrection story in John 20, when Mary Magdalene noticed that the stone was rolled away from the tomb, she ran to the disciples to inform them about what she witnessed. However, a lack of response, either from Peter or other disciples, to Mary Magdalene's grief indicates that the disciples did not respond to her, but just rushed to the tomb to witness it for themselves. They do not talk to Mary even after they witness the tomb, When the angels saw her weeping, they called her woman, not by her name. They asked her why she was weeping. She said to them, "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." And we do not see any extended conversation with the angels as well. But when Jesus saw her weeping, he calls her by name at a time when her worry was not acknowledged and when she had no companions to share her sorrow. Remember, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb alone. Jesus calls her by name, identifies the reasons for her grief, recognizes that nobody accompanied her after his death, acknowledges that her grief is multifaceted, and identifies that the way she likes is to be identified. By calling her Mary in verse 16, engaging with her in a theological discourse, and commissioning her to be the apostle to the apostles, Jesus acknowledges Mary Magdalene with her full potential. Recognizing individuals with their full potentials should be an integral part of good pedagogy. A good instructor will not just focus on disseminating information, but recognizes the wisdom that comes into the classroom. Scholar of inclusive teaching and learning, Emily Stiles says 50% of the curriculum walks in the door with the students. Intersectional pedagogy then acknowledges the epistemological experiences of the students that walk into the room and will affirm the holistic contributions and vulnerabilities of all the students. Just as Jesus acknowledges Mary Magdalene as her whole self, we are invited to embrace the pedagogy of this good teacher to be intersectional. Two, intersectionality affirms diversity. Second, embracing intersectionality and the intersectional lens is an affirmation of diversity. As educators, we can do this in various ways. In a context when diversity has become a cliche representing anything and everything that is different, I think diversity is to be understood as like a polyglot, someone who communicates in multiple languages. By virtue of knowing multiple languages, although depending on the person, they might be comfortable with one language more than the others. Their access to multiple languages enables them not just to communicate, but also translate. Diversity works of seminaries and seminarians then will be similar to the function of the polyglot, who not just knows to communicate, but is able to translate the language for others, to understand, allowing those who do not know the dominant language to feel welcome into the inner space of the conversation. Like language, diversity has dual aspects: being and becoming. It requires careful consideration because, like any human artifact, language changes. Its relevance shifts. Its authenticity needs improvement with time. While diversity is an acknowledgement of distinctiveness, multiplicity, heterogeneity, and the like, a prerequisite for any diversity work is equality and an analysis of power. And so intersectionality is similar to diversity if we acknowledge it for what it is, instead of simplifying it. And so by affirming diversity, we commit ourselves to reflect the wonderful diversity of human creation and to live lives at the crossroads of the intersection of the diverse creation. Embracing and embodying diversity involves more than recognizing unique markers. It is to create an ecosystem that ensures everyone's contributions are acknowledged, uniqueness celebrated, presence welcomed. Diversity then gives exposure. Exposure uplifts biases. Awareness of biases create a desire to their erasure. Desire to erasure of differences result in affirmation of differences. Affirmation of difference allows celebration of difference. Celebration of difference gives rise to the trust in the community. Trust in the community allows integrated work. A perfect integration can only be symbolized by the perfect unity of the triune God. The triune God interacts with one another of the Godhead to affirm life in abundance despite who we are. And so we are invited to that freedom, to acknowledge that diversity, and embrace the intersectionality, where we are invited to allow, to practice, and to embody that freedom. Thank you. I call Jess.
Hi, everyone. It was important for us as a group to both concentrate on the theoretical and the highly practical. And so in the toolkit that you will be receiving, if you signed up to receive the toolkit on the link that's in the chat, you will receive a pre-work that professors and pastors can do before engaging in leading a workshop or leading a Bible study or teaching a class or different things like that. And one of the things that we really need in people who lead things, so I'm just going to refer to leaders, is for them to examine their own assumptions. So, for example, how important is eye contact to you? I spend most of my time around queer and trans, neurodivergent, and autistic folks. And in my community, eye contact is considered painful and rude. And so different professors have different opinions about that. And so, one of the things that you will see in the list of questions is examining for yourself what you need to feel respected. So I am queer and disabled, and my spine is disintegrating and does not hold me up very much. And so I would go to my professors when I was in seminary and I would say, hey, so my brain works fine as long as I don't have to sit up. Could I lay on the floor of your classroom and then I can still engage in class? But if that's not okay, I can't come to class because I can't sit up. I also frequently, honestly, don't go to church because I can't sit up in pews for the length of a church service sometimes. And it's a dynamic disability. It's Ehlers-Danlos. My joints are all in different places when I wake up every morning. And so I would have some professors say, that's incredibly disrespectful. If you can't sit up, you do not belong in my classroom. And so I wouldn't go to their classes. Another professor would say, oh, sure, that's fine. I'm just happy to have you in class, and just call out if I can't see you raising your hand from the floor, and I would love to have you engage. And so, one of the things that I want to invite people to do before they lead is to examine themselves. What do you, as a leader of a group or a presenter of a group, need to feel respected, to feel heard, and what things are outside of what you can handle? So, for example, in some communities, call and response is a normal way of interacting. There are some professors from other worldviews where if you try call and response while they're giving a lecture, you will be, I mean, that will cause problems, right? And there are other professors who would love call and response while they're giving a lecture or giving a sermon, right? And so if you know what you need as a professor, you can, or a leader of a Bible study or workshop, you can write in your syllabus, here are things that are important to me. If this doesn't work for you, please let me know so we can come to an agreement about it. Right. And so if you absolutely cannot be interrupted, right, there are other forms like for professors who have ADHD. Like my child does, he's very good at distracting teachers in school, right? He's in junior high and he knows which teachers also have ADHD, and he will ask them questions and interrupt them all the time to get the kids out of having to do actual work that day, right? And so if you know yourself that you cannot be interrupted while you are presenting, write that in your syllabus. Academia and culture in congregations comes with all of these unwritten rules and assumptions about how we are to interact between the person in the front of the classroom, the person in the desks in the classroom. Um, And so clarity is kindness, right? That's one of the things I really had to learn as a pastor. Clarity is kindness. So if I know, for example, for other autistic folks, reading social cues is really hard. And they don't know what their professor wants. They don't know what's okay and what's not, because the autistic community communicates in very different ways than the neurotypical community. And so if you say what you need, you actually make more room for students to relax and feel more comfortable in your class. And so I will be sending that out in the toolkit about the questions that you can ask, the ways that you can prepare yourself. It also comes with ways that you can regulate yourself. I know sometimes it's easy. Every professor and Bible study leader and pastor, we are all humans. We all have triggers. We all have things that will really upset us if somebody says something to us, right? Um, so it's really important that you know those things about yourself. You do your own internal work, and then you decide that you are the leader. It's your job to do the teaching. You take a deep breath, you take your stuff, and you go deal with it somewhere else, right? So, for example, if I use inappropriate language about trans folks and a trans congregation member comes to me and says that I did that, right? I will feel devastated inside because I've worked so hard on that in my own life. And instead of taking it out on this person, I will call my accountability partner, who is not heterosexual, but she is cisgender and she is white. And this also happens in racial interactions where I make a mistake. I go to my accountability partner and deal with my feelings there. And then I learn how to behave better. And knowing that I have a place later to deal with whatever comes up in me when someone is confronting me about something gives me the ability to really listen. And a little bit later, we're kind of going from theory to practical things you can do like over the summer or before program years start or before classes start. And then Carrie will teach us in a minute about things that you can do to help your students get on the same page about intersectionality at the beginning of the semester. And then a little bit later, I'll share some more tools that we can use to solve problems. So when things come up, when cultural clashes come up, when intersectionalities come up, what is a method that we can use to work together as a classroom or work together as a leader and a student to solve those problems. And so thank you for your attention. I hope it is helpful for you to start examining some of your assumptions about how preaching and learning situations work, and to figure out how to maybe open that up just a little bit. And we'll provide a bibliography and a list of reading materials for you as well to explore this further. And I will send it over to Carrie or Lamont. Carrie,
It's
right?
me. Yes, thanks, Jess. And building on Jess's conversation about how we prepare ourselves as leaders, I want to go into a practical application of how we can also assist our students, or I have also used this in congregational settings if intentional communities are coming together. For example, working with reconciling in Christ groups in ELCA congregations as they are going through that process to help engender a learning community in which people feel that they can enter and the fullness of the Imago Dei within them is affirmed. And before I enter into that, I do want to say I am Carrie Aldridge and use pronouns like she and her. I come to you from Chicago, the indigenous lands of the Potawatomi and other First Nations peoples, and bring a sense of wanting to hold and engage a variety of wisdoms in how we create classrooms and how we create spaces within our faith communities as well to come together intersectionally. And as a cisgender, able-bodied, queer, white feminist, I come at this with both privilege and spaces of working within marginalized communities. And as a biblical scholar, I echo some of Helen's desire of a biblically grounded idea of engaging the Imago Dei and putting this in the center of what it means to learn with one another. The work of Paulo Freire and his work, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, a liberatory pedagogy that focuses not on just leaders imparting wisdom to students or to congregations, but instead shifting to a problem-posing idea of what it means to come into community to learn, in which we work collectively to find answers that we do not try to find one capital T truth, in my case for what the Bible means, but instead to hold space for truths that are dynamic and in conversation with one another. And to be able to do this in the classroom or in a congregation, I find it is helpful to do pre-work, as just shared about ourselves, but then also to invite the communities we are engaging with to become part of this and to have agency in creating the space in which we will learn together. One way that I do this, and I'll share one practical tool today, is through a pre-class survey. I will use this in the context of a classroom, but again, it's easily transferable into other group settings. In the resource packet that Jess was mentioning, there will be a standard template for creating this. Today, I'm going to show you a particular template I used for a course I taught last year on queer hermeneutics. The aim of this survey is to help you as the leader or the professor to get to know the students who will be part of your learning community, but also to see different ways that you can promote learning and success in the learning space. So I'm going to share my screen and walk you through what this survey can look like. I also am a big fan of free resources, so I do this in Google Docs. You can do this in any resources that you have available, but this is often an easy way for students to engage a survey. I also run this before the class through our class course site on our LMS, which is also another very helpful way to make sure everyone has access to that. And if there are concerns with internet access or availability, that they can also engage you on that level. So the survey has three major parts. The first part will begin with an introduction to the class and the survey. This is very important because it is important to tell people as they are sharing personal information with you, who will view the information they share on this document. So for example, I am the only person that sees this, but if you have teaching assistants who might see it, it's important to name that for a sense of safety and confidentiality. Again, everything but the first page is optional. I want people to feel an ability to share what they are comfortable with. So sharing names as institutions have them, but then also to share a preferred name that they may like to use in class. Also to generalize a pronunciation guide for your name. So often in global communities that are our classrooms, certain names are preferenced and seen as easier. During my teaching at NYU, there was a sense that any international student would immediately adopt a Western name because it was easier for their colleagues and professors in particular to engage with. But how do we also open up the possibility for people to be engaged with the name they most prefer? Similarly, having students share their pronouns, again, because different communities and cultures approach pronouns and understandings of them in different way. Providing a link is extremely important. I've found with many of our international students at LSTC, it is helpful to provide context of how we are using these pronouns. Similarly, I give students the option to give me the pronouns or name that they would like me to use in personal private correspondence with them. This allows students for whom they may be exploring new names, they may not want to publicly use certain names, to have an option to say, if you would like to use this in our personal engagements, you are welcome to do so. The second section of the survey primarily focuses on the class. So this will be particular to your course. What are you, why are students in the course? What are they interested in? And what are their learning goals? So often our syllabi tells students what they are going to learn, but encouraging them to co-create their learning goals with you can be empowering as they are thinking about the communities that they are a part of. Which comes to the last question, which I strongly encourage in the survey, which is to ask students to identify their community or communities of accountability. This may be a home congregation, this may be a cultural or identity-based community. And what this allows us to do is to say, when we enter the classroom, we are entering not just as ourselves, but with those who have shaped and formed us, both in positive ways and potentially in traumatic or violent ways. But for students to think the work that we do in education is not just for ourselves, but also for the communities we come from and plan to minister with. Finally, the third section is really about co-creating the learning space. First is telling that we are all multidimensional intersectional people who have families, who have different language abilities, different needs for work and socioeconomic strategies, and to give space for students to actually tell a bit about what barriers there may be to navigating the course. Also, in doing this, it empowers students to say, yes, I care very much about what we are doing as a community. My ability maybe to not get something in is not a reflection at all about a disinterest in what we are talking about, but that I might need space because of these other aspects of my life I also must attend to. And going from the students' lives to the classroom itself, in our case, it's very much in a hybrid state, but there's an interest in how do we create accommodations and accessibility within the classroom. I had a student for whom a white background on a PowerPoint with black font was the most migraine-inducing situation that they could have. So changing a color scheme, changing Zoom practices, as Jess shared, an ability to lay down for class, an ability to say, I've been in class for 6 hours already. Can I stand in the back of the room? Creating a space that people feel welcomed into can be very helpful in creating these communities from the start, so that you can have this answered in before classes even start and be prepared. And then also, the final thing I will say is please respond to the survey. Integrate what the students have said. It can do great harm to you have these surveys and then do nothing with them. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lamont about storytelling. Thank you.
Thanks, Carrie. It has been my pleasure to work with this team. That's what we are. We're not just a group. We're not just a group together. We're a team because we've gathered together to kind of place some of these thoughts together. And again, I'm Lamont Anthony Wells, and I am in Philadelphia right now because I'm usually everywhere else in the world, on the land of the Lenape people. And I serve as the executive director of the network of ELCA colleges and universities. And one of the first things that I wanted to say is NECU, as we're often called, kind of has a tagline or theme, says that we're called and empowered to serve the neighbor so that all may flourish. And when we think about that as something that is ideal, the question becomes, how do we create that, right? That kind of atmosphere and learning experience for our constituents, our stakeholders, and our students. And so I engaging this intersectional pedagogy topic and understanding, was surprised to find that storytelling is a key hack, if you will, in being able to navigate this as an opportunity, if you will, for there to be an amplification, particularly of certain voices who are often not put into the mainstream or dominant narratives. I remember and I recall my true connection to this subject, and that's why this piece of storytelling is important to me, is because in seminary, we all have to take homiletics courses and preaching courses, and so I tended to do well in the preaching courses because of oratory skills or whatever, but I never got 100 on any of my tests or exams. I always either got a 95, and my professors would always take 5 points off because I had this way of preaching that was sterile and descriptive and did not infuse and or engage my life story or stories that connected me to the biblical story and or connected me to the community that I served. And I wonder why that was, right? Like, did I feel like my story wasn't worth being able to share in that? There could be a myriad of reasons why, and I'm still dealing with that in therapy, so I don't have it explained right now. But what I will say is the gift of storytelling for our engagement in intersectional pedagogies is a versatile and I truly believe an impactful tool that can help some of our institutions and organizations that often focus on dominant narratives, if you will, right? Particularly in theology. And as I've seen institutions struggle with diverse content, and they often go to the go-tos, like a lot of times the James Cones, God of the Oppressed, and Cornel West, Race Matters. But what about Dolores Williams and Renita Weems and Wilda Gaffney and Amish Young, Asian theologians, and others that have something to offer in their own placement in the story, especially Wilda Gaffney's Woman Midrash. She just takes that to a whole nother level of telling many stories and lifting them up and amplifying them. And so one of the things that I want to say is the power of this is it helps to build empathy and reduce stereotypes in how we understand each other and how we understand text by telling some descriptive kinds of stories. In our study together, some of us took the course on storytelling and understanding different forms of story and liturgical storytelling and those kinds of things. But I want us to understand that it enables us as educators to bring diverse perspectives into the classrooms, as I said before, fostering empathy and deepening students' understanding of complex social issues, right? It kind of helps grow that area by incorporating personal narratives, historical accounts, right? Multiple historical accounts and multimodal storytelling, which is key and important because intersectional pedagogy can benefit from a variety of these storytelling mediums, including written narratives that we may not know about or find out or need to discover, spoken word, digital media, visual arts, and performances. As Jess talked about, many of the cultures and communities are often not just prescripted to an academic way of writing, right? But a more inclusive way of sharing a medium through digital and the arts in various kinds of ways. For instance, students could create digital storytelling projects that blend video, photography, and personal narratives to explore themes of identity and intersectionality. And this approach helps to broaden the possibilities of storytelling, enabling students to communicate complex ideas in creative ways. Isn't that the biblical story? A complex idea, a consortium of complex ideas, but learning how to share them in complex and creative ways. One of the other books that I think, and I'm going to put this that's in the chat as also that has helped me, is this book called Unearthing Joy, a guide to culturally and historically responsive teaching and learning, right? So there's some nuggets in here that I think can help the classroom experience become more enhanced by presenting ways to engage creating safe spaces for dialogue, and empowering stories to be told. I also think, and we can't ignore this as well, it also makes you think differently and critically about things that you may not understand or take as face value, that you may have. So it gives a sense of critical thinking and analysis to say that this anecdotal way or this way of understanding the text is different, than the way it's traditionally been done. And watch this. Let's stay in the biblical story for a moment. Even Jesus used the power of story in a way with the parables, and so he took a cultural phenomenon in society so that people could understand some real and complex things to help them to be able to move forward, with a deeper connection and relationship, with the text, biblical story, and the biblical narrative. So I'm going to park there just for a minute because I can get so excited about this, as you can see. But they're examining these different contextual, contemporary, and historical stories can help enhance the narratives and the understanding that our students and ourselves, as professors and teachers, being able to give and offer different contexts and narratives. So I'm going to pass it now to Jess, who kind of bring us home.
All right. Thank you, Lamont. One of the things that we have been talking about is how essential storytelling is to the practice of intersectionality, and how important it is to engage the stories of people different from us. That is one of the things I think that really matters, is reading and engaging stories of people very different from us. And also, I think it's important that we think about in our own heads the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves, but also the stories that we tell ourselves about students. So, for example, people from my community are often told that they are lazy, that they are disrespectful, that they don't care about school, they don't care about their homework. Because they don't engage in things in the same ways that other people engage in things. For example, if the only stories you ever tell in your preaching and your teaching are about cisgender, heterosexual, monogamous, married people, you're leaving out a whole group of people, right? And they're not going to feel super comfortable in your class. If the only stories you ever tell about white people are about white people, right? Or the only books you read, or the only stories that you engage, right, in your teaching and leading are only about one thing or one worldview, you can't be teaching intersectionality. And so one of the things that comes up is problems, right? Like, you might have a conflict with a student or a learner in your workshop, or congregation member, or I saw that we have some people here from synod offices, right? You may have a conflict with a pastor who does things different than the synod office wants the pastor to do things. Or the pastor may be terrible at getting in their report to the bishop in on time. Like, we all know we're all kind of terrible at that, getting that done every year on time. And so I want to offer you the tool of the CPS method. So this is collaborative and proactive solutions. It's put together by a guy called Dr. Ross Green. There's a ton of evidence about it. A really great book about it is called Lost at School. Their website is called Lives in the Balance. And what they do is they offer a method for problem solving. And in Lost at School in particular, it gives you a method of leading a class discussion using the step-by-step guide in order to figure out the problem together as a class, right? So one of the things it does is it helps us start with Instead of telling ourselves that the student doesn't care or they're not engaged because they're not looking at us or because they're knitting during class or playing with fidgets during class or crocheting or whatever, right? We can tell ourselves, oh, maybe this is a kinesthetic learner and movement is the only way they can engage, right? Maybe eye contact is painful for them. And if they're counting how many seconds they look in my eyes, I won't, they can't actually listen if they're looking at me, right? And so we will go over this very, very briefly because we can only do so much in an hour, but it will be in your toolkit. So this goes along with how radical storytelling is, right? So here is one little section right here, right? Instead of be is so disrespectful, they never make eye contact. There are other stories you can tell yourself about the person, right? So Dr. Green's whole premise is people do well when they can. And if people are not doing well, and I will say this works for adults in congregations, it works for people in Synod offices, it works for education. And so there is a whole list of reflecting, listening, and clarifying questions. And so the important thing is when there is a problem, you ask the right clarifying questions, and you will have to update some of this for adults. And also it is really useful and really helpful for anything, right? So for example, if you are worshiping with a group of people who are blind and a group of autistic people, generally the blind folks want the music really, really loud. The deaf folks, sorry, want the music loud so they can feel the vibrations of the music, right? And that would send a lot of autistic people into complete sensory overload. And so what do you do when you have these competing intersectionalities, right? Or race and neurodivergence, or adding anything together makes things more difficult, right? So there is a whole method where the first thing you do is adjust the way that you tell the story about the person that is having the problem, right? And so there's actual language scripts that you can use here. And you can't skip the empathy step or the listening step, but then you can define your concerns not as the adult, but as the leader, because you're mostly working with adults. You define your concerns, right? So here's how this worked in my house. As we know, storytelling matters, right? David, my concern is that you don't seem to care about getting your homework done, and you will get detention, and your goal is getting into college, and you can't go to college if you never do homework. And after a week of me saying, I'm very concerned about your not doing homework at home and going through this entire process, my child figured out that the problem was he desperately needed home to be for rest and for renewal and for low pressure, and he needed school to be for school. And so he worked out a deal by himself without me doing anything other than saying, very concerned about you not doing homework, with a teacher. He stays after school 2 days a week now so that he can do all of his homework at school, and he has straight A's for the first time in his life. So the story I told about my kid was a little bit, I worked really, really hard on it because we've been practicing CPS for a while, right? Is that he doesn't care about his homework. He's irresponsible. Like he's never going to get very far in life. And turns out he knew how to solve the problem, right? And there are entire classrooms that you can use this method to solve problems with. And so I hope that this gives you a method when intersectionality issues come up or conflicts come up, right? In a classroom, a way that you can solve that by examining the ways you tell stories and then getting the whole story, and then everybody works together to come up with a solution. So thank you very much.
Thank you to each and every one of these panelists. And there's so much to talk about. So I welcome anyone who wants to write a question in the Q&A to tee that up now. And I am going to put out an initial question for our panelists, whoever wants to respond to. After you have been digging into these intersectional pedagogy lenses, then over the last months and this year, then I wonder this, what transformation that parishioners or students could walk away with feels really crucial to you, and why? I'll just repeat that again. So what transformation that your students or parishioners could walk away with, like that idea of sticky learning, feels really crucial to you, and why?
For me, it's examine your assumptions. Like, the best way to do it is to encourage people to examine their own assumptions and their own worldviews.
Thanks, Jess.
I would say it's, I don't know why I use the word intentional so much, but a level of intentionality about realizing how to unlearn some things that were not helpful, and to see this, in particular, intersectional pedagogies as a way to re-engage and to relearn some ways, rather than dealing with the drab, if you will, of the single narrative, right? Embracing the beauty of and the power of multi-narratives, and intersectional narratives in that way. So that's what I would say: being intentional about unlearning, and creative about relearning.
And I would build on what Lamont is saying too, that part of this relearning is, and it's a conversation we have had about moving with curiosity into the learning space and into community creation, that you're coming not just to engage content, but to engage the people, the wisdom that they bring into that community as well. And that all of this is an embodied part of the learning process.
And I think it's also important to be comfortable with the discomfort, because when we are talking about multiple narratives, when we are talking about multiple marginalities and all these marginal people, or all these communities coming from multiple marginal social locations, bring their narratives. And if those narratives do not align with my interests or my views of how I've the world and doing theology and articulating stories and everything, I think it is important for us to just be comfortable to sit with that discomfort and say that it is okay to have all those narratives. And I think it's important to read the scripture from all those various lenses and perspectives and realize that that complexity is part of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One of the learnings that I had that has impacted me deeply was around the idea that there are many different kinds of stories. And you can think back through biblical stories and you can see that this is true. Or I'm teaching worship. You can think about stories that worship itself tells, or stories that are told about worship, but that there are stock stories or these dominant narratives that get told and that actually replicate themselves in how society is, quote, supposed to function. But there are also these concealed stories, and those are stories that might get told less, but actually tell something different than the dominant narrative. And furthermore, there are resistance stories that actually kind of directly challenge something in the dominant narrative. And then there are transformational stories, and those invite people into a new way of becoming, or into a new way of seeing reality or living as oneself. And I think that for parishioners or students to walk into the world with more curiosity about the multiple layers of stories that are continually being told and forming who we are able to become is really crucial for our ongoing development and walking together in Missio Dei. Who is it that God continues to call us into becoming in this world? And how might we go about that together? Well, colleagues on the panel, if there are any last things that you wanted to say, I want to hold space for you. Then I see that we're at time. And so we want to thank the people who have come to this webinar for engaging with us and in our ongoing learning. And then also welcome you, as Jess has again dropped into the chat, to sign up for our deliverable, right? We've made a toolkit that we think can be helpful to you. And we welcome you to just adapt it to your own place and use it with your own people. So thank you so much for considering intersectionally aware teaching and leading with us.